video or our nucleic acid video. Our next key point is going to be discovery of DNA. So this is kind of just a brief history of DNA because they like to talk about it on your STAR test. All right, so one interesting thing about DNA is we actually didn't even know what it looked like until the 1950s. And, to this day, we're still figuring out exactly what it does. But what we do know is that it's your genes, and your DNA has a whole bunch of sections on it that are called genes. And each section of that DNA is going to code for a specific protein. But it wasn't until the early 1950s that these two scientists, Watson and Crick, so James Watson and Francis Crick, presented the double helix model of DNA. Before that, we didn't really know what DNA looked like. But over the last 70 years, we've discovered quite a lot about DNA. And we know that DNA is in every living thing. And in eukaryotic cells like ourselves, or eukaryotic organisms like ourselves, it's found in the nucleus of almost every single cell. In fact, in humans, it's in every single body cell except for your red blood cells, which are the cells that carry oxygen. So there's no DNA actually in your red blood cells, but it's in just about every other cell that you have. Now, if I ever needed to get DNA from you, I could still get DNA out of your blood because there's white blood cells in your blood that have your full set of DNA in it. All right, so here's a picture of Watson and Crick. This is one of the most famous biology pictures ever. These are your two scientists. They were pretty young when they discovered this, and they built this model here of DNA, showing that it was a double helix and that it had those nucleotides that are base paired together. But something really interesting about this, cool fact, those two guys didn't actually figure all this out. It's actually the work of this lady here, her name is Rosalind Franklin, that figured most of this stuff out. And what she was doing at the time, she was doing x-rays of really small things like DNA and viruses and stuff like that. And she used this picture here, this x-ray, to figure out that it was the spherical type shape, which is that helix shape. And if it wasn't for her work, those other two guys, Watson and Crick, probably would never have figured out what DNA actually looks like. Unfortunately, this was like the 1950s. Women didn't have as many rights as men. They weren't treated fairly. And the other two guys, Watson and Crick, got all the credit. And it wasn't even until after she died that they gave her any credit for her work. Unfortunately, she died really young, and she died of cancer. And most people think the reason she got cancer was because she was doing so many of these x-rays. And really, we didn't know that doing these x-rays at the time was going to cause these DNA mutations and lead to cancer inside of her. So she most likely killed herself by doing all this research. And then she didn't even get the credit for it until years later when I think it was Watson actually wrote about it and gave her credit for her discoveries. All right, so that's the end of this next video. And that should give you enough information to complete a couple more sections of that escape room.